So in today's video, I want to show you what you need to do to permanently loosen a tight psoas muscle or tight hip flexor. And I'm inspired to create this video because of this one. Almost 2 years ago, I posted this video in the hope of trying to help educate people on ways that they can permanently loosen a tight psoas muscle. And I'm really proud to say that at the time of this recording, that video is currently the most watched video on my channel. But being almost 2 years ago, it's also a great representation of the audio struggles that I had when I first started doing YouTube. And boy, do people like to let you know that there's an issue. I've been inspired to create a more updated version in the hope that it's even more helpful than the previous one. So with that being said, let me show you how to permanently loosen those tight psoas muscles forever. The secret behind trying to permanently resolve psoas tightness, counterintuitively, does not lie with psoas stretches. What we need to understand is that there are definitely some fantastic stretches that we can get you to do, and we'll go through a couple of good variations in this video. But if we're not taking a step back and trying to understand what's prompting your psoas muscle or muscles to be tight in the first place, then there's absolutely zero guarantee that just your stretching alone will cure you of your psoas tightness forever. And again, clinically as a physiotherapist, and if you've seen the previous video on the topic, you'll hopefully understand this, is that one thing that we do understand about the psoas muscle, but often forget when we're trying to resolve tightness in that muscle long term, is the anatomy of that psoas muscle. That psoas muscle attaches from the front of your thigh and it anchors into the lower back. So if you're not taking the time to also go looking for any restrictions and dysfunctions in your lower back, then you could be missing the single most important piece of information that's prompting that muscle to tighten to help out. So if you have been following the channel for a while now, you'll know that one of the best ways that I've found over the last 10 to 15 years to mobilize a stiff, tight, restricted lower back is with either a ball or a foam roller. It doesn't necessarily matter which tool you use to do this. The idea is where we put them and what you do while that device is in the right area. So for the purposes of this, we'll use the roller to begin with. But what we can basically do is clinically, I often find that stiffness at the base of your rib cage and the top sections of your lower back can be the hidden dysfunction that asks the psoas muscle to be tight in the first place. But the great thing about these exercises is that you don't necessarily need to know exactly what you're doing or the names and the labels of the tissue that you're pressing into. We want to base it on feeling for anything that feels stiff, tight, or restricted. So with that being said, if you start with the roller at the base of that rib cage, the top of your lower back, we can get you to recline back onto that roller and just gently move it up and down, looking for anything that feels a little bit stiff, tight, or restricted. Now, the secret to a good exercise is that we're not rolling as the exercise. We're just moving the roller up and down until you find something that you would consider that feels a little bit harder than it potentially could be. And we want to basically compare right to left. So for me, twisting to my right side here, the foam roller feels like it sinks in a little bit further, whereas when I come to my left side, it does feel a little bit harder, a little bit more dense, and a little bit thicker. Now, it's important to understand that you may have absolutely no pain or tenderness associated with your lower back generally, but we're looking for mechanical restrictions. They can be tender to push into, but if the opposite side feels tender to the side that feels stiff, we actually want to care more about the stiffness than we do the tenderness, because the stiffness is that mechanical handbrake, and that tenderness or pain is potentially a consequence of that mechanical dysfunction. So once you've found a level that feels comfortable to you and you found the side that feels a bit restricted, you can place your hands behind your head and gently recline back as far as you feel comfortable, allowing the roller to press into that stiff, restricted tissue. Now, obviously, if you aren't flexible enough to get your head back onto the ground, please have a couple of cushions there. We don't want you to feel like you're overly stressing yourself to do this. We need you to put a little bit of pressure through that area to allow that tissue to give. We want the joints underneath to loosen. We want any tight musculature to feel like it can release as well. Another way that you can do this is you can start with your head on the ground and bridge your hips up. And from here, you can drop those hips down to try and tension up the area as needed. But just choose the version of that stretch that you feel comfortable doing. Stay on each segment for long enough so that you feel like something actually changes. Once you spend a minute or two on one spot, then just gently move it up or down a little bit to go looking for all the areas that might be restricted that you may potentially never have noticed before. You can work your way up as high as you feel comfortable. You can come down as low as you feel comfortable. But the further away that you move from that junction between your ribcage and your lower back, you might start to get some diminishing returns. And ultimately, trying to find and mobilize any of those restrictions restrictions in that lower back that your psoas muscle connects to can take off one of the main prompts as to why that psoas muscle is tight in the first place. Take that away and you might find that these hip flexor stretches and mobility drills that we're about to go through may instantly become far more effective in the moment, but also make you feel like you're getting better and better and better over time, as opposed to just going up and down on the spot. So a really simple and easy stretch that you can do to quickly mobilize a tight psoas muscle is the kneeling hip flexor stretch. All that this requires you to do is to kneel, place the leg down that you're trying to stretch. You can definitely hold on to something if you feel you need that extra support. If this is uncomfortable for your knees, make sure that you can put a pillow or a towel underneath that. If that's still too much for you, we can do this sitting on a chair or at the edge of a bed and then just letting your leg drop behind you, just so that most of the pressure is through your hips and not down through your knee. But this is a very simple way to stretch a tight hip flexor if you do it correctly. So all we want to basically get you to do is being up nice and tall, keeping your trunk level. We don't want you to lean backwards or lean forwards. You want to keep your trunk together and shift your entire body weight forwards, essentially trying to leave your knee behind, looking for any tightness that you can feel right at the front of that hip. We don't just have to go forwards or backwards in a linear motion. We can get you to twist your body from right to left a little bit to find where the best version of your tightness might be. Because once you're there, it's not good enough to just hold this position for 30 seconds and hope that that tissue magically releases. It's not good enough. It doesn't work anywhere near as effectively as getting active. And what I mean by that is, if you can find a really juicy amount of tightness in the front of that psoas muscle, then if you can squeeze your butt cheek, tense up that tissue actively, make it work, hold this for 5 to 10 seconds. What this does is this gets your brain involved so that when you stop tensing, it creates this reflex that physically releases that muscle. And what you should instantly feel, if you've done it correctly, is you should then feel that you can go instantly further into the stretch than what you could before. And then all you need to do is just keep squeezing that muscle for 5 to 10 seconds, relaxing, going further, squeezing that muscle for 5 to 10 seconds, relaxing, going further. And very quickly, you should feel like that psoas muscle starts to release in real time. And that kneeling hip flexor stretch is a fantastic way to target that psoas muscle specifically. And as long as you're doing that PNF or contract relax stretching technique over the top, you'll hopefully be pleasantly surprised at how much benefit you can gain from just such a simple stretch. And the second fantastic stretch that you can do to quickly improve that hip flexor flexibility is the couch stretch. All this requires you to do is to get your knee back into the corner of a chair or a wall if you're flexible enough. Want to get your opposite leg up. And the idea with this is squeezing your bottom, keeping your back straight. We're trying to extend up through the front of your hip as far as you feel comfortable without needing to hold your breath or wince or feel like this is a horrible position. This has the potential to be a brutal stretch for some people because of how tight we tend to be through the front of those hips. And like we did with the kneeling hip flexor stretch, you can gently twist your body from side to side just to give you a sense of which angle gives you the best access to your hip flexor tightness. Once you've found it, squeeze your butt cheek, tense that thigh muscle, tense your hip muscles up as much as you can, make them work again for 5 to 10 seconds. Same idea, once that gives, you'll be able to go a little bit further into the stretch straight away. Repeat that process, give it a squeeze, then relax, go further and further again. Just make sure that you're not determining how far you go by how far back your shoulders go, because I can keep my hips in the same position and extend through my back and get a lot further back. We want to make sure that you're just thinking about opening up the front of your hips. You may not go as far, but we need to make sure the tension is here and not jamming up your lower back at the same time. As I said before, if you do find that that position is quite advanced for you, start by doing it onto a chair to begin with and eventually work your way down, paying attention to how it feels, but more importantly, the amount of progress that you can make with that hip flexor tightness straight away. So once you've spent some time mobilizing any potentially hidden restrictions in your lower back and figured out which hip flexor stretch or psoas stretch is the best version for you, we can also take a ball and go looking around that hip flexor psoas region for any other soft tissue or connective tissue that might also be restricting your hip extension or the function of that psoas muscle. And all you need to do with this is you take a ball, any ball, find the hip bone at the front of your hip. You want to place the ball on that bump and just come inside of that, which is where most of those hip flexor tissues reside. And if we can get you to lie down on your tummy and gently let that ball push in. Very quickly, you should be able to find a couple of spots that maybe the hip stretches or the lower back didn't necessarily affect. And again, I'm not a big fan of using the ball and rolling up and down tissue. We can be more specific and more effective with our techniques. There's two that you can try that can really fundamentally shift this restriction quickly. The first is if you find a particularly tight and potentially tender spot, like we did with our hip flexor stretches, you can squeeze that muscle, squeeze your butt cheek, tense up the tissue underneath the ball for 5 to 10 seconds. When you give, it will subtly relax, and you might then feel like the ball sinks in a little bit more straight away. You can move the ball around a little bit, go looking for the next tight spot, give it a squeeze for 5 to 10 seconds, and then relax and allow that to give. Just systematically work your way around the inside of that hip bone up and down that track, or anywhere else around that you might feel is also tight and restricted as well. The other strategy that we can use is we can incorporate movement into this exercise to shear free some restricted tissue. If you bend your knee, this can tension up the rec fem muscle, which isn't your psoas muscle, but it's also a muscle that crosses the front of that hip. If this doesn't do anything for you, the next step from here is to have your knee bent and then gently lift your knee up off the ground. Now, this can be a bit awkward for some people, especially if you're not flexible enough to get into that hip extended position. We don't want you to extend your back while you're doing it. We want you to keep the pressure down on the ball and imagine that you're pulling your leg backwards off the ground to shear free that muscular tightness underneath. Again, this is an amazing way to quickly shear free restriction to the point where as soon as you start, it might feel a little bit tender, a little bit tight, but then after a few of these motions, you might find that it very quickly starts to subside and feel a little bit more comfortable. But add that into the mix to make sure that you're not just addressing the hidden back component and that psoas muscle specifically, but anything else around it that could also be interfering with your sense of freedom in that area. So once you spend some time trying to mobilize that lower back and hip area, we need to have one more really important conversation. Following on from the theme of this video, where just stretching a tight psoas muscle on its own isn't enough to fix that and take away the need for it to want to be tight in the first place. Freeing up your lower back can genuinely be a tangible piece of the puzzle that asks that to be stiff and tight. But if you're not also taking note of how much time you spend sitting, especially in a hip flexed position, and position that you put your back into while you're sitting, then it might be unrealistic to expect your psoas tightness to disappear for good. The reason for this is because the things that we do most throughout our day logically can have the biggest influence on how our tissue feels. And for most people, one of the main things that we do each day is sit. Sitting on the couch at home, watching TV or playing computer games, sitting at your desk using a laptop, sitting down using your phone, playing an instrument, reading a book, watching a movie. It doesn't really matter what you're doing, but the position that you put your body into the most throughout the day has the most potential to influence the function of that body. And because sitting plays such a big role in our day-to-day lives, it's a great place to start when looking for the reason why your hip flexors have become tight in the first place. So if on balance, you spend more time in a sitting position where your hips flex to about 90 odd degrees and not enough time in an extended position where your knee's traveling behind your hip, then that psoas muscle won't have the need to be elongated and loose because the environment that it's in is consistently asking it to be a lesser version of itself. And while it's unrealistic to expect people not to sit down in this modern world, it is something that's worthwhile paying attention to see if you can optimize that more than what you currently might be. Whether that's trying to invest in a standing desk to stand up a little bit more to take away some of that unnecessary sitting, or if you're someone who has to sit a lot, maybe you can find times to stand up and get out of that position, maybe to take a break or to eat some food. But anything you can do to analyze the shapes and positions you get into the most, how much sitting's involved in that, and how much of that you can control versus how much you can't control. We really want to optimize the positions you put your hip into to make sure that that psoas muscle doesn't want to keep getting tight. And following on from that, we also want to pay attention to the position that your back is in while you're sitting as well. Because if we can understand the effect that mobilizing your lower back had on the function of your psoas muscle, and you found that there's a specific part of your back that feels a bit stiffer and tighter than anywhere else, and when you release that tightness, your hip flexor, your psoas muscle felt better, then again, there has to be a reason why that exact part of your back became stiff, tight, and restricted, especially if it's one side more than the other. And clinically as a physiotherapist, what I tend to find a lot is that if we look at the positions that you get into when you're not paying attention to your posture, we might find that where you let go, where the hinge goes, where you slouch through or where you bend through, may very closely line up with where you felt stiff, tight, and restricted. And again, if releasing that restriction helps you free up your psoas muscle, then it makes sense that we need to find ways and strategies to get you out of that slouchy posture long term if we're ever going to give that psoas muscle muscle a genuine chance to never be tight and stiff again. And for most people, that can be as simple as just physically being conscious of being up a bit taller. This does require more muscular endurance and tolerance to this shape. So it might take a couple of days or a couple of weeks to really feel comfortable holding yourself in this position outright. What you can also do in the meantime is that if you know that there's a hinge that you may create when you sit in a certain position on the couch, computer, car, whatever it is, if you can roll up a towel, if you can grab a cushion, stick it into that part of your back so that it's filling the gap that your spine might have naturally filled for so long. And by keeping you in that position, we're not prompting that tissue to become stiff and tight, which could be the first step in a number of steps that lead to this psoas muscle being tight and staying tight long term. So with that being said, there are plenty of different ways that you can stretch and mobilize a tight psoas muscle, but unless you're taking a step back and looking at this through a different perspective of your lower back function and your sitting habits, doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter what advice you've been given, you may not be creating the environment that your tight psoas needs to not feel like it has to be tight. So as always, I genuinely hope that was helpful. I hope that resonates with you. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel if you do like more of this content. Following on from that, if you are dealing with a persistent issue of any kind, whether it's an actual pain and injury, or you're just not able to do the things that you want to do the way that you want to do them, and maybe you're not getting the answers that you need from other people, please consider booking in an online consultation with me, and I'll leave the link in the description below, and we can try and figure out what the root cause of those issues might be, and then plot some tangible, results-based ways for you to get the progress that you're hopefully looking for. But once again, I genuinely hope all that was helpful, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.